Welcome to the Living Room Disciple podcast. Can't wait for you all to join us for our very first brand new episode of 2024. We're coming back from sabbatical and we're coming in strong with an amazing interview from John Carroll. He is the executive director of Dallas Willard Ministries. And today we're going to be talking about hearing from God. And I'm stoked because John's coming with like 14 years of experience kind of in the realm of spiritual formation. And I think he has the wisdom and discernment to help us navigate what does it even mean to hear from God, and can we hear from God? And I'm just stoked for our conversation today. We're going to head over there in just a moment, but real quick, a reminder that you can support us on Patreon. Just go to livingroomdisciple.com for more information, or in whatever app that you're using, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, whatever it is. If you can if you can subscribe, if you can do all of the things just so people can find out more and more about the work that we're doing here and that the message can spread. Or heck, if this episode is a blessing to you, just send it over to a friend. All right, now on to the show. Welcome to the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home. Hey, John, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Phil, for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's a huge pleasure to have you on the podcast. You know, a few months ago, we just met through the co-host, Nick O'Brien. And every conversation I've had with you up to this point has just been a remarkable blessing to me. And so I'm incredibly stoked to have you here and to share some of that blessing with our listeners. And just going to say it, we're stoked to have you too. You're the first guest coming back from our sabbatical. For our longtime listeners, they probably have realized that we took a month off. So coming back in February with brand new episodes. And dude, thanks for kickstarting our Living Room Disciple year. Woohoo!
Yeah, that is fun to be first out of the gate. Hopefully we'll set the tone for the rest of the season.
Actually, one of the reasons we wanted to start with the conversation is because I think we want to set the tone a little bit. So today we're going to take a moment and we're going to talk about hearing from God. Mm-hmm. And I have a very small story about this episode that I think our listeners might be interested in. So me and Nick have recorded tons of episodes at this point, but we had one episode that we recorded and never aired. And it was an episode in which me and Nick were trying to wrestle with this idea of what does it mean to hear from God and process through experiences about hearing from God. And when we were done, it was very, I think, helpful for the two of us in our own personal growth. But we took a day to kind of think about it, and we went back, and our producer was like, Anissa Live, she was like, maybe not. Maybe like that's not actually the most helpful episode for the world. And we realized that we weren't at a place of spiritual maturity ourselves to put words to this kind of incredibly intimate, but also universal, but not universal Christian experience, which is hearing from God. And so Thank you so much for being brave enough to help us tackle that topic.
No pressure. Just bring all the maturity, John.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind just coming to this conversation with all the wisdom that we could need, that would be great.
Oh man, that's going to be a tall task. I'm not going to promise everything, but I'll do the best I can. How about that?
I'm stoked. Well, let's start with the first question that I think for me and much of my Christian walk, I've kind of wondered, and that's, can a Christian, for example, in 2024, America, hear the voice of God?
Yes.
But what does that mean? What does that mean, John? Like, what does it mean that somebody can hear the voice of God?
Well, I really come at this with a Willardian lens. I mean, I've studied a lot of Dallas Willard's writings and in teachings on hearing God. I've read his book entitled "Hearing God" several times, but I would say that hearing God, very simply, is the blessing of carefully cultivating a conversational relationship with God. That to me is really what hearing God is. And Dallas would say that learning to hear God is much more about becoming comfortable in a continuing conversation and
Mm.
learning to constantly lean on the goodness of God. And
Mm.
so really, when we're talking about hearing God, there like a relationship with Him is implicit. It's absolutely essential.
I think this is where things are both beautiful and really difficult.
Hmm.
And so I like how you said a Willardian lens, just for those who aren't aware. That'd be like a viewpoint that comes kind of from like the thinking of Dallas Willard,
Yeah,
who was a writer and thinker through the 80s and 90s. Did I get that right?
yeah, and into the 2000s.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
And and from our intro, everyone knows that you're the executive director over Dallas Willard Ministries. And for me, I also recently read Hearing God. In fact, that conversation with Nick kind of made me confront the fact that I've had these lived experiences that,
yeah.
despite the fact that I'm a communicator by trade, I have no idea how to communicate them. So I started kind of finding material, and I had just finished Renovation of the Heart, which is a fantastic book by Dallas Willard.
Yeah.
And you know how, like, in the back of the book, they're like, also by Dallas Willard. I saw Hearing God, and I was like, all right, well, I got to get that. And so that text was incredibly helpful, I think, for giving me language.
Mm.
But when we talk about hearing God being a conversation and it being a conversational experience, there's an implicit idea in there that a person can, in some way, hear God speak to them.
Hmm.
And you know, I think what's interesting is I think a lot of, and I'm thinking about myself and many people I've talked to and ministered to, we're not too shocked when a pastor gets on stage and says, you know, I've heard from God. This is the direction of the church. We're like, all right, that sounds about right. You've got the job title. You're supposed to hear from the dude.
Yeah.
But you know, if I was to say like God is telling me to do X, Y, Z, that can come with a lot of skepticism in our culture because I think we're not really sure that someone can hear from God. And then that raises questions like, is this an audible hearing? You
Hmm.
know, when we look at the Hebrew texts, we look at Abraham, we look at Moses, it would appear that this is a audible experience that they're having with God.
Hmm.
We look at the prophets, you know, and the way that literature describes the experiences of these individuals makes it feel like, I mean, think about the calling of Samuel in First Samuel, like what, 2? And maybe it's First Samuel 3. And, you know, he hears God calling his name, and it sounds audible. In fact, he thinks it's somebody else calling him.
Yeah.
So this is really my question. It's a big one. John, is this an audible hearing from God, or is there some other way of describing this hearing experience?
Yeah. I mean, I would say people ask this question a lot. I think this is really of interest to people. You know, when they're, it's funny, but the original title to Dallas's book, Hearing God, was called In Search of Guidance. That was
Mm,
the original title, and it was that way for a long time until it was changed to Hearing God. And I think Dallas gave it that title because I think when people want to hear God, um, what they really mean is like they're looking to God for some sort of guidance. It's like,
mhm,
do I take the job? Do I propose to the girl?
mhm.
Do I which college am I supposed to attend? And so we're like, I don't know, and then we look to God and say, okay, God, help me out.
Yeah.
Um,
Almost like the spiritual GPS, right? Like I want to get to this destination of happiness, but I'm not sure which direction to take. So if you could just tell me when to
right.
turn, you know, and how to navigate there.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, but God's voice doesn't. I mean, when you do hear from God, it isn't always like, um, out loud. It's not an audible. I mean,
Mm.
sometimes God speaks to us in our thoughts,
Mm.
and we can sort of discern that God is speaking to us without saying anything out loud. We just hear from God in that way. Um, I think that maybe I don't know if like the culture kind of embeds that idea or kind of like makes it concrete for us because you watch a movie or a TV show, and whenever God is supposed to be speaking, it's like that big booming,
Yeah.
hear his voice. And it's like, oh, I'm finally hearing him. It was like, John, what are you about to do? This is a bad idea. Like,
Yeah,
oh,
I'm tracking. Yeah.
I'm not gonna make that decision. Thank you for telling me. I think that most oftentimes, if we do really hear from God out loud, it comes in the still small voice of God. And that's when we typically would hear God.
Hmm. So, and for the record, I'm coming to an agreement with you that we hear God oftentimes in our thoughts, but
Hmm.
that raises a million questions. I do want to just side note too that we're never going to be able to hit everything in a 45-minute podcast. But Dallas Willard's book, Hearing God, I just couldn't recommend it enough, and so we'll make sure to link it in
Yeah.
the show notes. And for those who are really interested in diving deeper, it's a slow read in the sense of like it's a book that I would read, and then I was like, oh, I got to put that down and just meditate on that for a minute. But probably the most important read of 2023 for me, which is saying quite a bit.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah. So I want to come back to this idea of hearing God in our thoughts because it raises a very obvious question.
Yeah.
How do I know that this is God? And so, we have this hypothetical situation. Do I propose to the girl, right? Or do I know this is going this direction with this individual? Do we commit to
Hmm.
like this lifelong relationship? And that's a huge question. And we wisely don't want to leave it up to our own wisdom. Many believers, right?
Yeah.
And so we pray. And I can actually I'll just share my own personal life. I can still remember having that prayer when I was thinking about my own wife. It was 2011. I was on a mission trip in Peru. And I
Mm.
remember just like laying on this bed in this Peruvian hotel and just praying and saying like, Lord, if this is the girl, like, let me know and I'll propose to her. I'll just tell me.
Yeah.
And my experience was I remember him saying, yes, like you're going to marry her. But, many times we've been married, going on 12 years now. Many times over the years, I've wondered, like, was that my own desires that just came out and I believe it was the voice of God, but, those moments of doubt or those moments of frustration or whatever it is. How do you know, John, that you're
Yeah.
hearing God's voice in those inner thoughts and you're not just hearing your own manifestations of desires, kind of this Freudian, like, ego kind of coming to the surface and leading you.
Yeah. So there's actually a couple things I could say about this. So if you were doing this podcast with Dallas Willard, he would talk about three factors that help us recognize God's voice, and that would be tone, it would be spirit, and then it would be content. And I'll unpack those
Mm.
three. So when Willard talks about the tone of God's voice, he's suggesting that the voice of God's going to always have a certain tone, like this particular tone, and there's a weightiness to it. And so it's a voice that impresses us. It comes with like this confidence, and we recognize it as something that we didn't think up on our own.
Hmm.
And I think this is a real big key, is that a lot of times, like the tone, like when we hear God's voice, it surprises us, and that may be a clue that you're actually hearing from God. Is that you're surprised by what God said because it didn't come from you. You're like, whoa, where
Mm.
did that come from? And uh, so that might be something to tune into. I mean, if you're having this conversation with God and something comes to you that comes as a surprise, then you should definitely pay attention to that.
Mm.
Uh,
Okay.
Yeah, the second part, is spirit. So first is tone, second would be spirit. So it's the spirit of God's voice, and that would be one of peacefulness and joy. Okay, so
Mm.
it's this warm presence of goodwill in our lives. It's not the voice of a bully inside us that's barking orders and yelling at us and pushing us around. You know.
Mm.
Um, there's a passage that is connected to this, James 3:17. So when we're talking about the spirit of God's voice, James 3:17 has this description about wisdom from above
Yeah.
as a
Okay.
description of the spirit of God's voice. Um, I've got my Bible here. I'll save your listeners a little bit of time. So this is what James 3:17 says. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy.
Mm.
And so that's the spirit of God's voice. And so you can feel reasonably confident that you're hearing from God if the spirit of the words that are coming to you take on that joyfulness and peacefulness and wisdom from above.
Okay, so when you're hearing thoughts that kind of embody that spirit, and it's weird because it's like I know exactly what you mean, even though like I feel like it's one of those lived experiences that everybody gets it, and I hope that's true. But maybe we have some listeners here who are like, I have no idea what y'all are talking about. But it feels like a lived experience. Like we've all had those inner thoughts that like feel like a bully, that feel like warm and loving and affirming and joyous. And okay, and then we have a tone,
Mhm.
and that tone is often surprising. The thoughts don't come from us, but it has a sense of weight you didn't use this word, but I'll add maybe authority. Like it just feels like it comes with presence.
Yeah.
So what's the third thing?
The third thing would be content. And these would be like the things that we know God will not say to us. Like
Mm,
if the voice we are hearing contradicts what we find in the Bible, then we can be certain that it's not the voice of God.
that's that's like the easiest one and like the most comforting one, and I feel like it's where a lot of us are. And I feel like when most people have this conversation, you begin with content, but then you quickly get into like, there's so much in my life that is not indicated in the Bible. The Bible is not going to lay out who I'm to marry and where I'm to live and what job I'm to take. And I think this is actually really important because you alluded to this, but we haven't said it. One of the most interesting things in my personal life I came to know the Lord when I was 18, and I felt like I was hearing his voice from the get-go.
Mhm.
I kind of came from a church background where that was a bit assumed. And I think that was a huge blessing, actually, because I never really had a moment of doubt early on. I probably went a few months or years before I was like, wait a second, is that God's voice? Am I,
Right.
what I mean? But I'd already made all these beautiful decisions following the Lord by that time. But but I feel like when we start having this conversation, we immediately go to content, then we quickly get it to this. There's so much stuff that's not covered, and then we immediately think of the big stuff. But as I've been walking with the Lord for, I guess, almost a decade and a half, almost 2 decades now, I think that most of my conversations tend to hone in on the little stuff,
Hmm.
and I think that's really interesting
Yeah.
because that's how my marriage is.
Mhm.
That's how my relationship with my children are. That's how my relationship with my friends are. We'll totally have seasons where we talk about those big things when they come
Right.
up.
Hmm.
But the day in, day out of my life is a grind, and the day in, day out of my relationships are, I don't know, they're just talking about like the weather, and that isn't a bad thing. And I've realized that like the accumulation of my conversations with God have tended to hone in more on the parts of my spirit that need to change. My just thankfulness and gratitude for like little things. Um, I've noticed the older I'm getting, the more thankful I seem to be.
Hmm.
I think it was it Ron Rolheiser in his book, Sacred Fire, I think, where he talks about this idea that like kind of an age, you just become more of who you really are. And so he's like, people who kind of develop a spirit of gratefulness by the time they're maybe in the latter years of life, you can just put a salad in front of them and they're just like, this is an amazing salad. And you're like, it's like a crappy Caesar salad, you know, but like thankfulness is just such a part of their life. So anyways, I'm seeing like things like that come about now, where like most of my conversations with the Lord tend to just be like, thanks. Like I saw you in that moment, that thing totally could have broke my foot and it didn't, and I'm really grateful for
Yeah.
that. And I just know that was you. Like I don't even want to play like.
Yeah.
So is that do you agree with that? Like, is that your experience too? Like, what are your thoughts?
Well, I definitely think as I've gotten older, I've become more grateful. I mean, I just think that experience kind of lends itself to that. Like,
Yeah.
you've experienced, those times when maybe it didn't go well. So when things do go well, you're just like, oh, thank you, Lord, for what I have in front of me, or for what you've provided. But I do think that experience is a big key to our relationship with God. Um, I really, a lot of it boils down to familiarity with God. Like it's that constant interaction with God over time that leads to experience, and we learn to really recognize the voice of God through experience. So, like for example, my wife and I have been married for nearly 23 years. Um, when we first met, I mean, she couldn't have picked my voice out in a crowd. Maybe we're at a dinner party or something like that. And I could have called to her from across the room, but she only knew me for a week or two, and
Yeah.
um, that. But now, I mean, I could call to her, and she immediately picks up on my voice. Um, Same thing like with my kids when they were young. My kids are 19 and 17 now, but when they were young, they played a lot of soccer, and they're running around on the field with their teammates, and they're playing against the other team, and there's parents on both sidelines, and dozens of parents are screaming at their kids, cheering them on, telling them what to do, but I can be on the sidelines screaming at my kid, telling him what to do, and he hears my voice,
Mhm.
and he does that. Well, how is that possible? Well, it's because he's familiar with me. There's a relationship there, and so it works the same way with God. There has to be that familiarity and that experience with God to really be able to recognize it. Oh, this now I'm hearing from God. Recognize that voice.
Mm. Dallas Willard talked about that in his book, Hearing God. And one of the most comforting things that he talked about, he kind of talks about this idea that like experience is essentially key. Like there's just nothing to replace that. And I don't remember exactly what he said, but I remember walking away with the indication, like just if there's an understanding from like the Lord that like experience is kind of needed to do this right, like to hear from God accurately, I guess, as it were, which
Yeah,
is what we want, right? Many of us just want to know what God's saying accurately, whatever.
right.
And experience is part of that. Then there's an understanding that we're going to mess that up, and that's okay. And I can think another thing, like as I'm thinking about and growing with the Lord, I'm realizing that so often intent trumps execution every time. At least in spiritual matters, when the Lord, when our hearts are pure and we're really trying, it
Hmm.
just feels like the Lord just honors the heck out of that. And even if we end up doing the quote unquote wrong thing, but we're really intent, or this is really what we thought we heard, or this is really what we thought would please the Lord. I just noticed that more and more seems to honor God. We were reading in Matthew, Jesus was challenged, and in our home church, we were reading Matthew, and Jesus was challenged about the Sabbath, during one of the times, and his disciples were eating the grain, and he gives the story of David and how him and his followers ate the bread, and then he gives the story of how the Pharisees break the Sabbath technically on the Sabbath because they prepare the meals. And he quotes from Hosea, and he says, "Man, doesn't the Lord just want mercy over sacrifice?" And it's like this little character of God moment that's so important. Like there's this heart condition that God cares about in his people.
Yeah.
And like that is more important than the actual physical actions of our bodies and what we do. And I'm noticing that as we come into hearing from God and wanting to hear, we're thinking we're here. Like if somebody out there is listening to this right now and they're like, I've been following Jesus for a long time and I've never feel like I've heard from God. I don't even know what that would be like. And I get nervous every time I have these thoughts. And I'm like, is that from God? Is that not from God? And they become fearful.
Yeah.
What do you say to someone, John? Like if someone's sitting before you and like, I'm just afraid that like I'm going to hear the wrong thing. I'm going to do the wrong thing.
Well, I would ask, what's the worst that could happen if you, make the other choice? Um, the, I think it would depend on, what they're really trying to discern. But I mean, the way that I could describe it is like say you have kids and they, you take them to the park and they go into the playground and there's a lot of different options of the things that they can play on when they're at the playground. Like they could climb on the monkey bars, they can go on the swings, they can get on the merry-go-round. Like all three of those are good decisions. Like I don't think that like if my kid were to get on the swings, I go, oh my gosh, you made the wrong decision. The monkey bars were there the whole time. I think all three things are good. So, if somebody were saying, I'm really afraid of making the wrong decision, I'd say, I mean, unless you're talking about something that is illegal or immoral or that would cause yourself or another person um, bodily harm, like, like I don't think God's up in heaven eating antacids over, you making a decision and then you're going, oh, like, is this the right thing or not? Um, I mean, I would say a couple things. I mean, like certainly take it to God in conversation. Um, take it slow, um, and then I would have some very close friends who know me well to be a sounding board, and I would weigh all those things together as I was making a decision, as I was trying to discern what to do, and maybe keeping in mind, those three things I was talking about with tone and spirit and content.
John, have you ever had that experience where you're praying and you feel like the Lord just says, John, do that?
I don't know if God's ever um, given me. Um, I wouldn't say that God's ever responded that quickly before, but um, I spent the first 11 years of my career working in corporate healthcare, and towards the tail end of that time, I was serving a lot in my church, and I really felt like God was tugging on me to go into full time ministry. And I remember after a series of experiences, um, I was the first in my office one morning, And the rule, the rule was, if you're the first person in the office, you had to make coffee for everybody. And so,
Sure.
so I unlocked the doors, get in, turn on the lights, and I brewed the coffee, and I poured myself a cup, and I sat down at my desk. And I remember this today as, as like as if it was yesterday. But this was back in um, 2008, and I was sitting in my office with the coffee, and I was looking at all the awards and plaques that were hanging on my walls, like all the accomplishments that I've done. And I heard God say in my voice, I didn't hear it out loud, it wasn't an audible thing, but in my thoughts, I heard God say, "This isn't what you're supposed to be doing with your life." And
Mm.
I was so confident that it was God that I called my wife, Amber, on the way home from work. And she could tell something was up. And so she's like, "What's going on?" And I said, "I think I want to quit my job." And she goes, "Awesome. What happened?" Because she knew for a
Oh.
long time that I was being called to ministry, and I hadn't quite heard from God yet. But um, but I really believed that I had heard from God that day. But that was over months of praying and discerning and
Mm.
conversations and everything with friends at church. So I so that, I mean, I've never been in a situation where I've prayed and I heard immediately from God, but I have had experiences where I clearly heard from God, and that was one of them. And
Mm.
I can confidently say, like, to this day, it was the right decision.
Mm. It's so cool. And I, for the record, I appreciate the consistency. One of the first times we ever sat down and talked, um, you gave me the advice. I'm processing through some things, and one of the things you had said was just take it slow.
Yeah.
And I've dwelt on that quite a bit. I'm not by nature someone who takes things slow. Um, but if a characteristic of God is patience,
Hmm.
and the scripture says it is repeatedly,
Yeah.
then I don't think we ever have to worry about moving too slow for him. You know what I mean? Like, it seems that if we take things slow with the intent of wanting to honor him, that will always seem. I mean, maybe not always. I don't want to put boundaries on things, but it seems like a general rule of thumb that if God is a patient God, then He's going to be patient with us as we're kind of working to keep up. You had I wish I had it on me at the moment, but during that same conversation, you had quoted me.
Yeah. Frederick Faber.
Yeah, I don't. Do you have that on hand?
Yeah. So Frederick Faber says this: in the spiritual life, God chooses to try our patience first of all by his slowness. He is slow. We are swift and precipitate. It is because we are but for a time, and he has been for eternity. There is something greatly overawing in the extreme slowness of God. Let it overshadow your souls, but let it not disquiet them. We must wait for God, long, meekly, in the wind and the dark. Wait, and he will come. He never comes to those who do not wait. He does not go their road. When he comes, go with him, but go slowly. Fall a little behind. When he quickens his pace, be sure of it before you quicken yours. But when he slackens, slacken at once. And do not be slow only, but silent, very silent, for he is God.
I've dwelt on that a lot since you sent it to me. And one of the things that stands out to me, and I think it is relevant to our conversation,
Yeah.
there's a heart check when we want to hear from God. That way we can get the knowledge and then just go. Like, it's almost like my heart condition sometimes. God, can you tell me what I can do so I can get the thing and then run away? and go do the thing. But I'll come back to you when I have a question again.
Yeah.
Versus a heart condition that says, I want to follow in your footsteps.
Yeah.
And so I'm coming to you not to understand you like a GPS, but to ask the question, where are you? And where are you going? And I will follow wherever that is.
Right.
And I do think the way we posture our hearts and desires when we come to God in prayer
Yeah.
has some effect on whether or not we hear from God. Maybe not a direct, it's probably some indirect kind of thing, but
Yeah.
there seems to be there are some people whose hearts are so geared and so turned towards following the Lord that their relationship with God is different.
Hmm.
Me and my sons are reading through Genesis. And so, you get to Enoch pretty early on, one of the greatest mysterious characters of the whole Bible. And it's this guy, a descendant of Seth, Adam and Eve's third son. And it just says that he walked with God and then he was no more.
Right.
This indication, this is a man who just really seems to subvert in some way the fall and lives out that life that Adam was supposed to have in some way and walks with God so intimately. And we go on through scripture, you get people like Elijah, right? Like that, who just seem to just want the Lord so much. So I do think when we think about hearing from God, there's a lot of wisdom. It was such a blessing. Dallas Willard's book, Hearing God, and he does talk about tone, spirit, content. I think he calls them like the 3 stars that we use what was it, three lights? Maybe 3 lights is what it was.
Yeah.
Which was such a helpful framework for me.
Yeah.
But I really don't think we can talk too much about the fact that like the heart condition we have when we come to God is really vital in whether or not we'll have ears to hear what God has to say.
Oh, totally. Totally. I mean, I think, going back to your original questions, we opened this conversation, like, is it possible for us to hear God in 2024? And, um, like, I mean, this is something that I heard years and years ago, but it absolutely rings true today, is that, we all suffer, our world suffers from what uh, Meyer Friedman calls hurry sickness, you know?
Mm.
And in hurry is different than busy. I mean, we're all busy. Busy has a lot to do with our bodies and our schedule, but really, hurry is a condition of our soul. And Dallas said that hurry is the great enemy of spiritual formation in our day. And the advice that Dallas Willard famously gave John Ortberg many years ago is that you must ruthlessly eliminate hurry, and that's where John Mark Comer got the title of his
Oh.
book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Because the
Mm.
thing is that there's a lot of things that you can't do in a hurry. You can't hear God in a hurry. You can't sleep in a hurry. You can't love in a hurry. These are things that
Mm.
you do over time, and they're slow. And really, one of the great ways to help you slow down is to engage in spiritual practices, the spiritual disciplines. Some people call them soul training exercises because they help our soul become trained into the kingdom life that
Mm.
God's inviting us into.
Okay, John, we're going to have you back at some point to talk through some of those other disciplines. Really, I want to, because this is a part of what I guess your profession is at Dallas Willard Ministries. And so just give us, as we kind of end our time, give us a little bit of a plug. So Dallas Willard was a writer and a thinker. And I think, I don't know if it was during his life or post his life, Dallas Willard Ministries was established, and a part of that is a school. Can you tell us a little bit about that school?
Yeah, so Dallas Willard Ministries was established while Dallas was still alive.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so he passed away from pancreatic cancer in 2013.
Mm.
And so it's been a little over 10 years since he's gone on to glory. But fortunately, the ministry still exists. And I was hired about 3.5 years ago to develop a program called the School of Kingdom Living. It's an 18-month immersion into discipleship that's intended for anybody who wants to put on the character of Christ and experience really the richness and the fullness of kingdom living. And what happens over the 18 months. So students will apply to be in the program, and then once they're accepted, then all the students they will begin a set of readings, and those readings will prepare them for a week-long residency. And we have 4 of those week-long residencies over the 18 months. And so the readings prepare them for the residency. We host the residencies at this beautiful monastery on the side of the San Gabriel Mountains in Southern California. Very beautiful. It's a perfect place to really retreat and be um, quiet with God. But the real key to the program is really the way that in which we teach at the residencies, because the way that we approach spiritual formation is highly experiential, and it's also highly relational. So I say that it's experiential in the sense that at the residencies, there will be lectures that our faculty give, and then we'll frequently follow up those lectures with a spiritual practice that connects to the lecture. So we're not merely talking about it, and you're not merely just gaining information. So you will be invited into this practice so that you can start to do the things that we're talking about. And then we'll give you space to do these practices, and then you'll come back into the classroom, and then we're going to process your experience with the practice in community. And that's where the relational piece comes in, because as you're sharing about this and learning from one another, those relationships go deep. And I can tell you that students who have done the program have become such close friends that they now vacation together. They still continue meeting online if they live far away from one another. They're very rich relationships and community is formed as a part of the program. But once the program's over, you graduate with a certificate from Dallas Willard Ministries, um, and we even have a relationship with 2 different seminaries. So Azusa Pacific Seminary in California and Northeastern Seminary in New York. And you can parlay your time in the School of Kingdom Living to get a master's degree or a doctor of ministry degree. And so, um, yeah, if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to connect with them offline and share more.
Perfect. And we'll have in the show notes, we'll have links to learning more about the School of Kingdom Living and where they can apply.
Yeah.
Because it is really cool. I think I just want to, one of the reasons we engage in this podcast is for Nick and me to grow ourselves, but also to share what we're learning. Being what we allow to form us shapes our relationship with God, shapes our relationship with others. But I don't know. I think more and more I'm realizing that who I'm becoming is one of the most. I wouldn't say it's one of the most important things per se, but in my relationship with Jesus, He cares very deeply about who I'm becoming.
Yeah.
And so when we take time to invest in the spiritual formation of ourselves, whether that's through listening to podcasts, reading amazing books, or taking time to say, like, I need to enter into a season of deep growth and invest in that through academia, through a program like yours, I think that's a really beautiful thing. And I think it's something that probably becomes quite the milestone in a lot of people's lives as they seek to follow Jesus into the kingdom. So,
Well, one more Dallas quote just related to that. I always have a quote by Dallas ready to go, but Dallas would say the biggest thing that God gets out of your life is not what you do, it's who you become. That's what you take into eternity.
Mm.
And we are trying to help people become like Jesus, so that they can go into their community, their homes, their neighborhoods, their cities, and be a light on the hill and help point people back to Jesus.
Thank you so much for joining us today on the Living Room Disciple podcast. My conversation with John, all my conversations with John are just huge blessings to me. And so I'm praying this one was a blessing to all of you. There's a really important book, I think, for this conversation. Dallas Willard wrote a book called Hearing God. We're going to link that in the show notes. It was one of my last reads in 2023, and it just blew my socks off and gave me language for things that I really did need language for, and a framework for hearing from God that was just vital. So I can't recommend the book enough. Hearing God by Dallas Willard. Again, link in the show notes. You can also find the link to the School of Kingdom Living that John helps lead and teach. And so definitely find out more information there, because maybe the Lord's calling you to invest in your spiritual formation through a program like that. So don't forget, you can find out more about us on livingroomdisciple.com. Huge shout out to Anissa Live, as always, for just the amazing production work that she does on this podcast. To Eric Church for getting this podcast out into the world. And to Daniel Ramirez for the composition of the Living Room Disciple music. We hope you love it. We love it. And we're just grateful to you. Thank you to you for listening and staying all the way to the end. Make sure to like, subscribe, and do all the things. All right. Thank you so much for joining us on the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home.